I never, in a million years, sitting in the cockpit of a twin-engine medical transport somewhere over the sweltering swamps of Tampa, Florida, thought that my most critical, most desperately improvised landing zone would end up being the aggressively manicured, absurdly heavily regulated front lawn of my own suburban home. But life has a funny way of stripping away all your neat little expectations, leaving you standing there in your kitchen on a perfectly normal Sunday evening, helplessly, watching the man who raised you, the man who taught you how to throw a baseball and how to check your oil, clutching at his chest as his face drains of all color, his eyes rolling back in an agony so sudden and violent that it practically sucked the air right out of the room, while just down the street, at the pristine wrought iron gates of our exclusive little community, the woman who had made my life a living hell for months stood there with her ridiculous, bureaucratic clipboard, literally, barricading a multi-ton emergency vehicle from reaching a dying man because they didn't have the proper neighborhood guest pass. If you had told me 3 months prior that I would be orchestrating a hostile airborne takeover of Cypress Point Enclave, I would have called you insane, because 3 months prior, all I wanted was peace, a little slice of quiet after spending 8 grueling years pulling shattered bodies off highways and out of remote canyons as a medevac pilot, moving back to the Gulf Coast because my dad, Arthur, was getting up there in years, and after we lost my mom to a brutal, drawn-out battle with cancer. The silence in that old house he was living in had become so heavy it was practically crushing him. So I made the call, packed up my life, and decided to buy a place close by so I could keep an eye on him. Maybe cook him a hot meal a few times a week, and make sure he wasn't just sitting in the dark watching reruns of old westerns. The real estate market was an absolute nightmare, a bloodbath of bidding wars and cash offers, and the only place I could find that didn't require a total gut renovation and was less than a 10-minute drive from my dad was this gated, ultra-planned, obsessively controlled neighborhood called Cypress Point Enclave, a place where the houses all looked like they were stamped out of a sterile, beige cookie cutter, where the trees were planted at mathematically precise intervals, and where the air always smelled faintly of expensive fertilizer and quiet desperation. I grew up in a working-class neighborhood where people rebuilt muscle cars in their driveways on cinder blocks, where fences were mismatched and nobody cared if your Christmas lights stayed up until February. So when I signed those closing papers, I had this sinking, hollow feeling in my gut, a quiet warning from the universe that I was stepping into a velvet prison. That warning manifested in the flesh on my very first day, taking the shape of Brenda, the president of the Property Owners Council, a woman whose smile was as sharp and cold as a scalpel, who approached me as I was carrying my first box into the house, extending a hand adorned with too many rings, her eyes raking over my faded jeans and worn-out work boots with a level of disgust she didn't even bother trying to hide. "Welcome to our little sanctuary," she had purred, handing me a leather-bound binder that possessed the sheer weight and density of a medieval text, informing me with a voice dripping in condescending sweetness that the community standards were the lifeblood of Cypress Point Enclave, and that I would do well to memorize them before making any unfortunate missteps in my new environment. I should have run right then. I should have eaten the closing costs and put a for sale sign on the lawn the very next morning, because what followed was a descent into suburban madness, a psychological war of attrition where the battleground was measured in fractions of an inch and shades of paint. The other people living there weren't entirely awful, like David and Sarah right next door, a terrified young couple who literally smuggled their golden retriever out the back door under the cover of darkness, because Section 4 of the bylaws explicitly stated that no animal over 20 pounds could be visible from the street after sunset or major haze. A retired Marine across the street who treated his property line like the demilitarized zone, fighting a relentless, passive-aggressive shadow campaign against Brenda over the exact, permitted height of his privacy hedges. And then there was Chloe, a sweet, exhausted pediatric nurse a few houses down, who had recently been hit with a severe financial penalty because her visiting nieces had the absolute audacity to draw a hopscotch board on the sidewalk with washable chalk, an act of terrorism that Brenda claimed severely impacted the visual harmony of the pedestrian pathways. My own personal file with the Property Owners Council started growing thick barely 3 weeks after I unpacked, beginning with the infamous grass incident, where I was out sweating through my shirt, pushing a mower under the oppressive Florida sun, only to turn around and find Brenda literally kneeling on my lawn with a Stanley tape measure, informing me with dead-eyed sincerity that my grass was precisely a quarter of an inch above the mandated 2.2-inch maximum, a violation she documented with a photograph before informing me that my mailbox, which had come with the house, was midnight cerulean, instead of the strictly mandated nautical navy, a transgression that would result in a compounding daily fine if I didn't get out there with a paintbrush within 72 hours. Things escalated from absurd to downright unhinged, with citations appearing taped to my door like threatening ransom notes, fines for a garden hose not being coiled in a perfect, hidden spiral, penalties for leaving my truck in my own driveway instead of the garage for more than the allotted 4-hour window, and a formal, aggressive warning for a set of bamboo wind chimes that my late mother had given me, which apparently violated the strict, pre-approved acoustic aesthetics of the neighborhood. The breaking point, the moment I realized I was dealing with someone deeply, clinically disconnected from reality, happened when I hired a local guy named Vince to replace the rotting, dangerous wooden planks on my back patio. A minor repair job that was instantly halted when Brenda materialized like a ghost at the fence line, demanding to see 3 different structural permits, an environmental impact form, and a notarized material sample, completely unmoved when I tried to explain that the wood was literally crumbling under my feet and posed a severe safety hazard, merely smiling that terrifying, thin smile and suggesting I simply stop using the back door of my own home until the council could review my petition at their monthly gathering 3 weeks later. Vince packed up his tools, looked at me with a mixture of pity and horror, and told me he had worked in high-security military bases with less red tape, leaving me standing on a half-demolished deck, holding a $250 fine for unauthorized exterior construction, wondering how long I could survive in a neighborhood where basic human logic was considered contraband. Despite the suffocating environment, I kept my head down, focusing all my energy on my dad, keeping up our sacred Sunday tradition where he would come over to my place, bringing a bottle of cheap red wine while I slow-cooked his absolute favorite meal, a heavy, rich, braised pot roast with root vegetables that always made the whole house smell like childhood and safety, a smell that usually made everything else fade away. But lately, Arthur had been looking a little frail, the color in his cheeks a bit washed out, and I had caught him more than once rubbing his left shoulder, grimacing silently when he thought I wasn't looking, waving away my concerns with that stubborn, old-school stoicism, telling me it was just indigestion, just the aches and pains of getting old, telling me to stop mothering him and focus on my own life. I knew I should have dragged him to a clinic. My medical training was practically screaming at me that something was wrong. But he was a grown man who hated doctors, so I let it slide, a decision that would violently, tragically backfire on that fateful Sunday evening while the pot roast bubbled on the stove, the air thick with the aroma of rosemary and beef broth. We were sitting at the kitchen island, laughing about some ridiculous story from his days working at the shipyard, when the laughter just stopped, dying in his throat as his fork clattered against the ceramic plate, his hands instantly flying to his chest, his fingers curling into tight, desperate claws as a terrifying, wet gasping sound ripped through his lips. "Dad," I asked, the confusion lasting only a fraction of a second before the paramedic in me took over, watching in sheer horror as the life seemed to drain out of him in real time, his eyes widening with an animalistic fear before his knees completely gave out, sending his heavy frame crashing down onto the cold tile of the kitchen floor. I hit the ground beside him, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, my hands instinctively checking his airway, his pulse, feeling the erratic, terrifyingly weak flutter of a heart that was actively failing, my brain shifting into overdrive as I pulled my phone from my pocket, my fingers flying over the screen to dial 911, screaming my address to the dispatcher, laying out the clinical signs of a massive myocardial infarction, my voice maintaining that cold, detached, professional calm even while my soul was screaming in pure, unadulterated terror. The dispatcher's voice was a lifeline, telling me the paramedics were already rolling from the station just 2 miles down the road, instructing me to keep him calm, to find baby aspirin, to prepare for chest compressions, all while I held my father's clammy, trembling hand, whispering to him, begging him to stay awake. watching the man who had been my absolute anchor in this world slipping away right in front of my eyes. And then, the phone in my pocket vibrated with a sharp, jarring buzz, a text message from Sarah next door illuminating the screen, a handful of words that made the blood in my veins run completely ice cold. Marcus, the ambulance is stuck at the gate. Brenda is out there. She won't let them in. I didn't even process the absurdity of it, the sheer, psychotic malice required to block an ambulance with lights and sirens blaring. I just reacted, screaming for my neighbor David who was washing his car outside, practically throwing him onto the kitchen floor to hold my dad's head while I sprinted out the front door, running down those perfectly paved, pristine streets with a speed born of pure, primal adrenaline, my lungs burning as I rounded the corner and saw the horrifying tableau unfolding at the entrance. There was the heavy, squared-off bulk of the rescue unit, its red and white lights casting violent strobes across the manicured palm trees, and standing directly in front of its massive grille, blocking the only entrance into Cypress Point Enclave, with her silver luxury SUV parked diagonally across the lanes, was Brenda, holding her godforsaken clipboard, arguing with a furious, red-faced paramedic who looked like he was 1 second away from committing a felony. You must log the license plate and provide a valid resident authorization code. Those are the security protocols. Her voice drifted over the idling diesel engine, shrill and utterly detached from the reality of the flashing lights. And as I crashed into the scene, practically hyperventilating, screaming that it was my father dying inside that neighborhood, she barely even blinked, slowly turning her gaze to me, her face a mask of bureaucratic indignation, lecturing me about how rules are what separate civilization from chaos, threatening to call the police on me for raising my voice, telling the paramedic that if he tried to push her vehicle, she would sue the city for everything it was worth. The paramedic told me they couldn't ram her car without risking disabling the ambulance. The gate was too narrow, and the police were still 5 minutes out, a lifetime when a human heart is starving for oxygen. And that was the exact moment something inside me just snapped, a cold, hard realization that playing by the rules in a madhouse is a death sentence. I backed away, pulled out my phone, and dialed a number I knew by muscle memory, the direct line to the aviation desk at my medevac company, the phone ringing exactly twice before my crew chief, Manny, picked up. "Manny, it's Marcus," I said, my voice dead and flat, stripped of all panic, vibrating with a terrifying kind of clarity. "I need the bird. I need it at my house, right now. My dad is coding, and the local HOA president has physically barricaded the street. She has taken the ambulance hostage." There was a heavy, stunned silence on the radio before Manny's voice came back, stripped of all protocol, sharp as broken glass. "Wheels up in 2. We're coming hot, brother. Clear the zone." I didn't even look back at Brenda, who was now smugly arguing with a newly arrived police officer who was looking at her like she was an alien species. I just turned and sprinted back toward my house, telling the cops over my shoulder that I was a flight medic and that a Class A trauma chopper was currently burning fuel to my exact coordinates, a statement that caused the officer to freeze in his tracks, his mouth hanging open as Brenda began shrieking about noise ordinances, about federal airspace, about the sanctity of the community aesthetic, her voice fading into the humid Florida night as I ran for my father's life. By the time I burst back through my front door, the ground crew had finally managed to force Brenda to move her car, and the paramedics were charging into my kitchen, dropping their heavy jump bags, slicing my dad's shirt open, and connecting him to the monitors, the sharp, erratic beeping of the EKG filling the room with a terrifying urgency. They looked at me, their faces tight with the professional grimness of men who know they are losing a fight, telling me his rhythm was degrading rapidly, that they needed to get him to the specialized cardiac unit at Tampa General Hospital immediately, but the ground transport through the heavy Sunday night traffic would take at least 30 minutes. 30 minutes my father absolutely did not have. And right as the lead medic said those words, a deep, rhythmic, thumping vibration began to shake the framed pictures on my walls. The sound grew from a distant hum into an ear-splitting, physical roar, the heavy, twin-turbine engine of an emergency medical helicopter screaming over the rooftops of Cypress Point Enclave, the massive rotor blades beating the humid air into submission, and as we wheeled my father out the front door on the stretcher, The neighborhood had erupted into absolute chaos, residents pouring out of their identical houses, standing on their identical lawns, watching in absolute, dumbstruck awe as a massive, brightly painted aircraft descended like an avenging angel right into my front yard. The brutal downdraft whipped the manicured flower beds into a frenzy, tearing perfectly spaced petals into the wind, flattening the illegal quarter-inch of my grass, practically blowing the roof off the place. And through the dust and the blinding searchlights, I saw Manny kick the side door open before the skids even touched the dirt, jumping out to help us heave the stretcher up into the cabin. And then, pushing through the crowd of stunned neighbors and helpless police officers, her hair whipped into a feral, tangled mess by the rotor wash, her face purple with a rage so profound it bordered on the demonic, came Brenda, literally waving a stack of pink citation papers, screaming at the top of her lungs about unapproved landscaping modifications, about property values, trying to physically march right into the spinning tail rotor of a live aircraft to serve me a fine, forcing the police officer to tackle her, to literally drag her away from the spinning blades of death as she shrieked that we were all going to be evicted, that she would ruin us, her voice completely drowned out by the whining pitch of the turbines as I strapped myself into the jump seat next to my unconscious father, giving the pilot the thumbs up, feeling the heavy, beautiful pull of gravity as we ripped ourselves away from that cursed suburb, banking hard toward the illuminated skyline of Tampa. My dad made it. The surgical team at Tampa General getting him onto the table with only minutes to spare, threading a stent into a fully blocked artery. And by the time the sun came up the next morning, he was awake, weak and pale, but squeezing my hand, complaining about the terrible hospital coffee and asking if he had really taken a helicopter ride from my front yard, chuckling weakly when I told him he had single-handedly destroyed the neighborhood's pristine curb appeal. The fallout, however, was biblical, a reckoning that tore through Cypress Point Enclave like a hurricane, beginning with an emergency, mandatory town hall meeting called just 3 days later, a meeting where Brenda sat at the head table with her smug, righteous posture, preparing to read off a list of fines against me that totaled nearly $5,000, fully intending to initiate foreclosure proceedings against my home. But she fundamentally miscalculated the breaking point of the human spirit, because the moment she opened her mouth, Major Hayes stood up, refusing to yield the floor, pointing a trembling, furious finger at her, demanding to know by what right she played God with a man's life over a clipboard, a sentiment echoed by Chloe, who demanded a vote of no confidence right then and there. Brenda tried to bang her gavel, tried to cite bylaws and meeting protocols, but the room turned into a tidal wave of suppressed rage, neighbors who had been cowed into submission for years suddenly finding their courage, screaming about the blocked ambulance, about the sheer sociopathy of prioritizing guest passes over a dying man, and within an hour, through a little-known, unanimous override clause in the community charter, Brenda was entirely stripped of her presidency, her council, dismantled, and replaced by normal, empathetic human beings. She put her house on the market 2 weeks later, unable to bear the silent, judging stares of the people she had tormented, packing up her clipboards and her tape measures, and fleeing to some high-rise condo downtown where there was no grass to measure, and the poetic justice of the universe dictated that the buyer of her house was a guy named Julian, the chief flight surgeon for my very own medevac company, a man who thought the story of the helicopter landing was so legendary that he convinced 3 other trauma nurses to buy into the neighborhood over the next year, turning Cypress Point Enclave into an unofficial haven for emergency medical personnel. The fences came down, the dogs ran in the yards, the grass grew a little taller, and my dad helped me rebuild that back deck without a single permit, hammering nails in the hot sun, alive, breathing, and completely free. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? We build these gated communities, these invisible walls made of rules and regulations, all under the guise of protecting our investments, preserving order, keeping the chaos of the world at bay. But at what point does that obsession with control strip away the very core of our humanity? When we care more about the color of a mailbox than the beating of a neighbor's heart, have we really built a sanctuary, or have we just constructed a very pretty, very expensive trap?
Thanks so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button, drop a comment telling me your thoughts, And don't forget to subscribe, turn on the bell so you never miss the next one. See you in the next video.